It's the week ending Saturday the 3rd of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Matt Hancock resigning as Health Secretary after breaking his own social distancing rules, the death of former US Defence Secretary Donald Rumsfeld at the age of 88, and in the UEFA Euro Championship, England defeating Germany for the first time in 55 years. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, two people I bumped into at a cafe in London the other day, just like life used to be. Joe Evans and Julia O'Driscoll. It'll surely never happen again. Plus, from The Economist, a man I've never met, but our Zoom game is strong. It's tech and science correspondent Alok Jha. And I should say in advance, if you hear some background noise, I can see that there are some children playing in the background of Alok's Zoom. And I think some drilling going on in Julia's house as well. So apologies for any of that. Joe, you are starting us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The Pakistani city that's too hot to handle.
It's mid-afternoon in Jacobabad in southern Pakistan. It's about 41 degrees Celsius. Now that, I'm told, is quite a mild day for Jacobabad. It was much hotter than that last week. And indeed, at times, this town of 200,000 people can get to 50 degrees or more. Now scientists say that Jacobabad is at the forefront of climate change because, according to scientific literature, it's only one of two places in the entire world which has crossed a very dangerous threshold.
Ben Farmer, Southeast Asia correspondent for The Telegraph, in a video from Monday. Joe, I don't know if he always talks like that or if he was laying it on a bit thick and he was a bit out of breath. But tell us what the story is.
It was, to be fair to him, very hot. So as he said, Jacobabad, a city in Pakistan, has been famous for a long time for its incredibly fierce heat. But new research has found that fierce heat is even more fierce than we originally thought it may be. The mixture of heat and humidity in Jacobabad has made it one of only two places on Earth thus far to have passed a threshold where it's actually hotter than the human body can withstand.
OK, so obviously not good news for the citizens of Jacobabad. Or the other place? Where's the other place? It's north of Dubai somewhere, isn't it?
It's Ras Al Khaimah in, north of Dubai.
Yeah, OK. But, I mean, what about for everyone else? Is this indicative that more and more places are going to fall into this category?
So this is the concern. The reason that this research has emerged is because climate scientists at Loughborough University were analysing global weather station data, and that was how they stumbled across this discovery. But obviously the concern is that as climate change increases, more and more places get hot. Lots of areas of the world that are already very hot are already incredibly humid, and the concern is that more areas will pass this incredibly dangerous threshold.
Well, that's the thing, Julia, isn't it? These places are already very hot anyway. I mean, Dubai and Jacobabad, they're on the equator anyway. So can you make a strong link with climate change, do you think?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And it's not just necessarily about places where, we've passed the threshold of temperatures. I think it's also about what temperatures it's possible to sustain normal life. And also looking at kind of less extreme temperatures as well, when we've got more instances of droughts, floods, and effects to rainfall as well. That then obviously impacts agriculture, industry, and causes a lot more kind of climate migration on a less extreme level. It doesn't grab the headlines in the same way as the words of kind of exceptional temperatures, intolerable temperatures do, but it is having a real impact already.
Yes, because in Jacobabad, obviously, there's some poverty, Joe, and people can't go anywhere. Whereas in the other place that we're talking about in the UAE, there's a lot more money floating around. People have air conditioning units, people have solar panels. So it's maybe not always obvious that people are coping with these kinds of conditions because technology can intervene.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important point. The inequality element of this is incredibly important. Jacobabad and, as you say, Dubai are sharing the temperature issue, but they certainly don't share economic issues. In the UAE, electricity and air conditioning, things like that are plentiful. It's very easy, essentially, to spend an entire hot season indoors. Whereas in Jacobabad, people subsist on sort of day rates and day wages, often only a couple of pounds a day, so you can't just stop work and stay inside. Electrical solutions are constantly being undermined by power cuts, and also actually just sort of the expense of spending on electricity is also often very difficult for people. The solution is to obviously install solar panels, but at £36 each, that's obviously kind of very expensive. Ice is currently one of the most popular ways to deal with this, which is sort of hacked into smaller pieces and sold on the roadside. But again, if it's incredibly hot, then ice doesn't last very long. And so we already know that some of the hottest areas in the world have a disproportionate share of the poorest people in the world. Sub-Saharan Africa actually has the largest share of the global poor, around 50%, but South Asia has 33% of the global poor. And so you can see very clearly that these extreme temperatures combined with these very poor living standards are already a massive issue, but will become an even bigger issue as climate change increases those temperatures.
And Alok, can you talk us through the temperature threshold then? So what does this extreme temperature do to people's bodies?
So extreme temperature does a few things. First of all, if you feel hot, obviously you sweat, and that's the way your body cools itself. But if the air around you is incredibly humid, the sweat doesn't go anywhere. And so your body temperature will just go up and up and up. And so there's a measure that scientists use called the wet bulb temperature. The wet bulb temperature is where you have a thermometer bulb essentially that's wet. And if the water on that thermometer can't evaporate, then you've reached the wet bulb temperature. And the thing is that even very low actual temperatures, 20 or 30 degrees, can be very dangerous if the humidity is very high. So, if your humidity is 100% and your wet bulb temperature is something like 30 degrees, it doesn't sound like a lot, but actually for older people, for vulnerable people, for children, these temperatures can kill very, very quickly. And a couple of things happens. One, your body just gets very hot. If you get to 42 degrees Celsius, you're dead. There's no way around that. And again, if you can't evaporate the sweat, then your body temperature will just go up and up. If you've got cardiovascular problems, if you've got asthma, if you've got any other underlying health issues, you will also suffer. And of course, people who are poorer disproportionately have a higher number of these sorts of issues. If you're living in places which are hot and you don't have good housing and everything, then you're more likely to have those problems. Now, you said something about these temperatures and problems happening in places around the equator. Actually, they're happening all over the world right now. So in northeast America, so Canada, in places where there's glaciers and the winters are full of bears and snow, Lytton, a town in Canada, has got to 50 degrees Celsius this week. This is not a place that should have that sort of temperature. It should have it once in 1,000 years. That's the average. It's happening regularly. And in California, this is happening as well. Huge temperatures. Obviously, then dry conditions, which cause wildfires. And we've seen wildfires in the American Northwest in the last few years that have killed lots of people. I mean, it's hard to underestimate how bad the temperatures are getting. We've been talking about rising temperatures for so long. This really is it.
And Julia, President Biden is much more willing to make a public spectacle of tackling this subject, at least, head on, isn't he? I mean, as with so many of his public pronouncements, very much in comparison with the prior person who held his post, he's making a point that he has a different view about this. And he was talking about the issues that have been affecting Portland, Oregon, for example, and how hot it's been there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's great to see that Biden has kind of come at this full force and is very much looking to address issues that have been under Trump were made a lot worse in terms of climate. I think there is a lot to say, as Joe's kind of mentioned, about who's in the room when global climate agreements are made. If you look at kind of the G7, the Paris Agreement, there almost feels like there's a slight reluctance to engage with kind of climate migration as well as climate change at an intergovernment level. US and Japan are two of the highest emitters of carbon dioxide. Would actually the targets that are set at these summits be more rigorous if you had more voices at the table from across the globe? And I think Canada provides, at the moment, seeing the death toll rising there that's being reported almost every day, where in comparison, the situation on Jacobabad, I think the first report came out on Monday and there's been relatively little coverage since then, which I think also speaks volume on that issue.
Well, when you've mentioned climate migration twice now, be specific. What do you mean? What are the pinch points? Where are people actually moving from and to?
Yeah, sure. So climate migration is happening in places where Climate change is felt most extremely on the front lines, so it's often in countries in Africa that it's affecting a lot at the moment. 23 million people moved last year due to climate and weather-related disasters. So that can be extreme disasters such as tsunamis or hurricanes, or it can actually be more of the ongoing lower level but continually challenging weather-related disasters such as droughts and harvests, as we've mentioned. And it is mainly happening at the moment within country borders, but I think it's not surprising that people are also predicting there's going to be mass migration in the coming years. It really brings to light a lot of the predictions and forecasts that were spelled out in the Uninhabitable Earth in 2019, and it's happening faster and faster.
Yeah, I suppose the difference as well between a kind of seismic weather event where we can all sympathise, a tornado that rips through your town or a flood that, takes away your house, Joe, is that this is kind of about average temperatures. This is about kind of daily encroachment on everyone's life, a whole generation being used to temperatures that are basically too high to actually withstand, but it's a slow creep.
Well, that's it. The concern among climate scientists is that it won't just be people in places like Jacobabad living through 50-degree summers. It will be everybody, and it is a sort of incremental change. As you say, it's not a one-off disaster. If you look at heat records for the last 2 decades, they're terrifying. 18 of the 19 warmest years on record have occurred since 2001. And we're already seeing extreme heat kill people in far more developed countries. The US estimates that extreme heat kills about 1,500 people a year. There was a heat wave in Europe in 2003 that's estimated to have caused around 70,000 deaths. The concern here, as you say, is this is an incremental change and it's an average creeping up, and that might not be as sort of jarring to people. But the reality is, and what climate scientists are telling us, is that we're reaching a series of very crucial tipping points. The concern is that then a global cascade of tipping points will lead us into a completely uninhabitable world, as Julia just mentioned.
And tipping points, Alok, is the phrase that's used to indicate an irreversible moment, something you can't go back and change.
Yeah, so in climate science, the phrase tipping point means, for example, if the global average temperatures rise by a certain amount, and for example, let's say the ice on Greenland melts. The ice on Greenland sits on land, and if it melts, it goes into the sea. Global sea level rises, and you can't reverse that. It means things like Antarctic ice sheets collapsing. You can't reverse that. It's those kinds of things that people worry about, and that leads to even more. If Greenland melts and sea levels rise around the world, that increases storms. It increases problems all around the world. It's a runaway effect. It's worth saying that heat, in all its forms, heat waves, rising temperatures, kill more people than any other climate effect right now. Storms, hurricanes, all these things that get headlines and have been related to climate change more and more, which have been increasing also, by the way, they don't kill as many people as heat. Heat kills a lot of people. And as Joe said, the heat wave of 2003 still goes down in history. The temperatures didn't even get beyond about 30 degrees C, but so many people, especially old people in cities, living in apartments at the top of buildings with no air conditioning, they died. And this is like a rich continent, Europe. And climate migration has been happening for a long time from places in the equator, which are getting increasingly hot on average, to the temperate zones. Northern towards middle and North Europe. So from North Africa, north, obviously. So you've seen that happening for the last decade or so. People in boats across the Mediterranean constantly. That is climate migration. That's what's happening, because crops are failing in North Africa and in the Middle East. So all of that is happening already. The EU's been thinking about this for a long time. They know that more people are going to come from places that are just impossible to live in, and ultimately it is up to places like the EU, the US, China to do the work to reverse some of these trends.
Yeah, and that might be a message that possibly resonates in Britain, Julia, because, if you're just being completely self-interested, looking out the window today, it's supposed to be summer. Still not very hot, is it? I could do with another, 8 degrees on this quite happily. A lot of people in Britain think, well, of course it's a shame for the world, of course it's a problem, but actually for me personally, it'd be quite good if the world heated up a little bit over the rest of my lifetime. I'd have a nicer summer. But the message of, well, all the people that are going to move from the countries they can't live in anymore coming to Europe actually might resonate with some of those people.
Yeah, I think if you look at kind of media coverage and public responses to the so-called migrant crisis, which, as Alok says, has been fueled by climate migration for the last 10 years. It shows that people really don't want the impact of what this is going to mean for everyday life. And unfortunately, cutting, emissions and slowing down global warming is going to take drastic lifestyle changes. We saw pollution drop massively during lockdowns, but obviously that's not a sustainable solution in the longer term. So I think it's also really important that we keep these very human stories at the forefront of this issue. It can so easily become all about targets and what politicians are saying, and actually we need to just be able to keep this at the level of this is what it will mean. It could be us.
Okay, Alok, you're up next after this. Okay, Alok, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A new type of nuclear energy.
General fusion is transforming how we energize the world. We're preparing to build a first-of-a-kind fusion demonstration plant to showcase our magnetized target fusion technology. The result of over a decade of development, it assembles proven components into a scaled version of our commercial machine.
Canadian tech company General Fusion and their demonstration plant video released on YouTube last week. Alok, please hold my hand and talk to me like I'm 3 years old as you tell me the answer to this. What's happened this week?
So this is something I get really excited about. Nuclear fusion is a way of generating power that, in the broadest brush terms, could potentially provide us with an infinite amount of power, electricity essentially, for millions of years, an infinite amount of power with zero carbon emissions.
Okay, but that hasn't happened this week because I remember that from GCSE chemistry.
No, it hasn't happened yet. But someone's got to design and build the technology, and nuclear fusion has kind of been a dream for physicists for about 60 years, but it's been very, 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 very hard to make. And so just stepping through what it is, in a nuclear power as we know it now is all about taking big atoms like uranium and splitting it in half, and then that releases some energy, and then that produces heat, and you produce electricity. But we all know that nuclear power has problems attached to it, around proliferation of weapons. There's radiation that comes, radioactive waste that comes out of it. People don't necessarily like it, even though technically it's actually a very good source of energy. Nuclear fusion does the opposite. It takes very light elements like hydrogen, so the lightest possible element, bashes them together, and they fuse into helium, which is another gas. And in that process, you release a little bit of energy, and then that is nuclear fusion. And technically, you can then use that heat to make electricity. Now, in theory, it sounds wonderful.
And it doesn't have the risks. You couldn't get a Chernobyl from nuclear fusion.
No, well, nuclear fusion, basically, the products are a little bit of radioactive waste, but really very little compared to nuclear, the other type of nuclear energy. And once you switch off the power plant, it just stops. It's not like nuclear fission, the splitting of the atom, where once you start the reaction, it will just keep going and going and going. And if you're not careful, it could become a chain reaction and become, eventually that's what a nuclear bomb is. Nuclear fusion is actually very, very hard to get going, and you have to keep it going. And if you switch off the button, it just switches itself off. It can't go any further than that.
Okay, so I will ask again, what has happened this week?
So nuclear fusion has been, as I said, a dream for physicists for a long time. It's very, very hard to do because you need technology and you need materials that kind of haven't existed for a long time. And there's been one major project, a government project, which is 20 governments around the world have spent billions of dollars trying to make this work. Because if you can make it work, it's unimaginably good. But that project's been delayed, and it's being built in the south of France right now. It's this massive project called ITER. And if it proves anything, it won't produce nuclear fusion power until about 2050. So it's a long time away. So lots of private companies have come along with venture capital money to sort of redesign the technology around nuclear fusion using, advanced manufacturing and new materials and AI and all sorts of other things. And General Fusion is a Canadian company that is one of those companies. There's about 10 of them that are trying to make nuclear fusion happen much more quickly. They think that they can get nuclear fusion onto the grid by the end of the 2020s. That's incredibly ambitious. These small nuclear fusion plants, and their technology is a specific design that they think they can build, and they've announced they're going to build their experimental reactor in Oxfordshire, and so that's what they announced this week.
And should people be enthusiastic as Alok is about this, Julia, or should people listening to this who may live in Oxfordshire be worried that there's experimental nuclear technology coming to their county? I mean, after all, why aren't they building it in Canada if they're a Canadian company? Seems convenient for them to put it where we are.
I'm glad I'm not the only one who was taken back to their GCSE science exams looking at this story. But speaking of that, when I was learning about nuclear, the side was very pro-con. People weren't sure where we stood on it, but actually there's been a huge change in attitudes from environmentalists in recent years. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez last year said that her Green New Deal will leave the door open for nuclear energy, and advocates for decarbonisation are very pro-nuclear now. Renewable energy is only going to get us to a certain percentage of the targets that have been set to reduce carbon emissions. And actually, at this point, we do need an alternative type of energy, not necessarily instead of renewables, but actually working alongside as kind of a combination of energy sources could provide a really positive impact.
So, Joe, why should we be any more optimistic that a private company will be able to achieve what the decades of work and billions of dollars in research that Alok referred to have failed to do when it's gone through government?
Well, I mean, it should be said that private companies are just often very good at innovation, aren't they? And I think there's no reason to be sceptical because it's a private company. The slight concern, and I can understand why there is a degree of scepticism around the excitement around the new project, is because we have been promised sort of commercial fusion power plants for a very long time. There's a sort of running joke that it's been sort of the next thing coming for about 30 years. It should be said at the same time, there is now an increasing number of people working in this field who are very confident that they can get this done in a sort of commercially viable way in a short space of time. There's a guy called Stephen Dean who runs Fusion Power Associates, who are also sort of researching this area. And he said that he sees absolutely no fundamental reason really why none of the current crop of developers or contenders to get this to market shouldn't be able to build a reactor that generates useful quantities of energy in a short space of time. So I think there is great reason to be optimistic.
Okay. But both you and Julia have come up with more positives. I mean, Alok is obviously behind this, and I'll go back to him in a minute. Can you give me some cons? I mean, are there some reasons why we should be sceptical about this?
I mean, as I say, I suppose the con is that building a fully workable, commercially viable fusion reactor in 20 years or even 10 years, as this new company have suggested they can, is immensely ambitious, and it's a colossal undertaking. By comparison, the Hinkley Point C nuclear fission reactor, which is the type of technology we already use, isn't expected to be finished until 2025, and it will have taken 15 years from proposal to completion. So that's using technology we already understand. It's technology that we already use and have used extensively for a long time. So, the slight con, I guess, here, or that if you want to find a negative angle for talking about this, it's that it's an immensely ambitious project and that it may well not come off in the timescale that's being promised.
It's just one thing to be really clear about. We talk about this as nuclear energy. This is not your mother's nuclear energy. This is not the normal sort of... this is not nuclear power in the same sense of nuclear fission. And so there is no risk of proliferation. You can't use this for nuclear weapons. It's just a completely different technology. The reason it's in Oxfordshire, by the way, is because Oxfordshire is the world's one of the world's best places for fusion energy. It has been for about 60 years. A lot of the best fusion scientists are in Oxfordshire, a place called Culham. It's where several private companies are based. It's the Joint European Torus, which is the most advanced nuclear fusion experiment in the world, is based in Oxfordshire. So they know a lot in that part of the world. So General Fusion, yes, it's a Canadian company, but it wants access to the best scientists, which happen to be in Oxfordshire.
But is there an increased risk of having it in your country for the reasons you touched on earlier? I mean, the other thing people often say, maybe who don't understand enough about nuclear power, is that there's a terror risk as well. Someone could somehow fly a plane into it.
You can't use this technology to create explosions, basically. It just doesn't work like that. It's actually very, very hard to get going. The stuff you use, the fuel, is hydrogen, which is just a harmless gas. And that's it. So the thing about fusion is that if you can get it to work, the world it enables you to inhabit is... all electricity is essentially carbon free and it's unlimited. It's cheap. It just means that you can desalinate water to get water to places that are water stressed. It means that all these sort of pressures you have around the use of energy around the world just disappear. The other thing to say is I was going to make one of the point which I've completely forgotten now. What was you saying? Oh yeah, why the private companies? why private companies? Well, the thing is, at the moment, fusion has been until now a government enterprise, and governments spend billions of dollars on this. And yes, it hasn't worked because it's very, very, very hard. What you're trying to do in fusion is essentially mimic the interior of stars. That's how stars produce their power, the nuclear fusion. So it's incredibly hard to do. So it's been very hard to do, and governments don't like to take risks. They like to be accountable to their taxpayers, and so they spend money, but it takes a long time. And so that's why the design that's being built in south of France, ITER, is a very well-established design, and it should work, but it's going to take a long time. The startups are doing completely different designs that are very risky. They may not work, and they're being funded by venture capital essentially. So they take risks. Plus, also, they're using techniques and methods that are very modern. They use much better computers to design things than ITER does. They use much more advanced materials. They use magnets that are much, much, much more effective at containing the materials you need to do the fusion, which ITER can't use because it was designed 20 years ago and it can't now sub them in. And so look at what happened in the space industry. For about 60 years, NASA, the Russian space agencies, and so on, they created rockets, sent people to the moon, in NASA's case, and so on. But then they sort of lost their leadership to SpaceX.
And now Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are going to get there first. Okay, so on that parallel then, Julia, why is it that this doesn't get the coverage that those stories do? I know space is sexy compared to nuclear fusion, but actually this is more useful, isn't it, than taking tourist trips to the moon? This is something that actually, tying into our previous story, could help not reverse but dramatically cut back the carbon emissions we're making on this planet. Why doesn't it have much traction with people?
I know, it's an interesting one, and maybe it is that there isn't a figurehead at the front like Bezos, who, I don't know if he makes space sexy, but at least makes it a talking point that people want to discuss, trying to find interesting images of nuclear plants, or even trying to sell that story online. I think I would find incredibly difficult working in digital journalism. So I think it's trying to explain to people that obviously there's been public perception about nuclear for a long time and the potential of what that means. We've got Chernobyl is doing incredibly well as a TV series. People are kind of interested in that side of nuclear rather than actually the opportunities that it might now offer. And I think trying to break down that public perception and almost take people back to their GCSEs and say, no, actually, we do know more now, and here's what you need to know, is going to be a real challenge.
Alok, the Jetsons had flying cars, and that was 20 years ago it was supposed to be. So when put a date on this for me. When is this, in your view, going to actually be up and operational and providing electricity for us if everything goes the way it's supposed to?
There's been a joke in the fusion community that in 1950s, when the first fusion was done in experiments, that it would be 40 years and you'd get commercial power plants. And we're in 2021 and it's still about 40 years away. And so this is the joke that people constantly talk about. But genuinely, I've been covering this for a long time, and I always make that joke at the beginning of all my fusion articles before talking about the nuclear physics. But I genuinely feel something's different this time, that given the amount of effort, money and creativity going into it, that within 10 years you might have experimental fusion reactors putting electricity onto the grid, and within 20 years you might have the large-scale base load electricity that you kind of need. 25% of the world's carbon emissions come from electricity production, and if you could just shake that out, I mean, what an amazing difference it would make.
Okay, Julia, I'm coming to you next after this. All right, Julia, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this medieval torture or a modern diet device?
I kind of assumed, well, maybe it's some form of technology that reduces appetite. I didn't take it as literally as I was meant to take it, because, as it says, an inventor has attracted interest and criticism from around the world for a weight loss device that keeps your mouth shut. That's right, it keeps your mouth shut so that you do it like this, so if you want to put anything in it, you can't hurt anything in it. It's a pretty simple idea. 2 magnets are inserted onto opposing top and bottom teeth, and when engaged, they ensure your mouth can't be opened to insert food.
YouTuber and wrestler Simon Miller on Tuesday. Julia, what's the story?
So researchers at the University of Otago in New Zealand have developed a new intraoral device for weight loss. It's called the Dental Slim Diet Control, and it's received a lot of criticism online this week. So The university tweeted out the new discovery that has been, and the research that's been published in the British Dental Journal, and it has just gone viral for all the wrong reasons. People are comparing it to, as we said, a medieval torture device, and it's actually now in recent days also attracted criticism from eating disorder charities as well.
Well, hold on, what is it? What is it? You're calling it a device. I mean, to look at, it looks like a magnet that's paired with another magnet that keeps your jaw shut. That's it. It's a filling with a magnet on it.
That is essentially it. So it's a device that uses magnets for the first time to aid weight loss. And the idea is that the device is cemented onto your teeth for a 2 to 3 week period, and the magnets stop your mouth from opening more than 2 millimeters. Patients who have the device put on will only be able to stick to a liquid diet. The researchers say that they can still talk, and there is an emergency lock that can be undone so that if, choking or anything else happens, that it should prevent a fatal incident. But not going down well. People are also comparing it to jaw wiring, which was a practice in the 70s and 80s where people did die from choking on vomit as well. So, and it can lead to dental complications and infections. So a lot of people, understandably, not too happy to see this being recommended as a diet device as well. I think that's what's alarming, is that the name mentions slim and diet. But also, the lead researcher has said that the idea is this device will only be used in very specific cases when obesity could lead to much more severe clinical complications.
Yeah, so I mean, as you say, the University of Otago is probably not used to suddenly having thousands of people engaging with their tweets. So I went back to the original one to see what they've replied, and they have added a couple of addendums. They say, to clarify, the intention of the device is not intended as a quick or long-term weight loss tool. Rather, it is aimed to assist people who need to undergo surgery and who cannot have the surgery until they have lost weight. After 2 or 3 weeks, they can have the magnets disengaged and the device removed. They could then have a period with a less restricted diet and then go back into treatment. This would allow for a phased approach to weight loss, supported by advice from a dietitian. Joe, in that context, it's not really any less drastic than the weight loss surgery that the person is waiting for, is it? I mean, they're about to have their gastric band tightened. What's the difference?
Well, yes. I think in that particular context, I can understand. It does slightly feel, right, like a sort of a science university that isn't brilliant at the PR side or communication side of science doing that wrong. Because as you say, this is very specifically intended for people that need to drastically lose weight very, very quickly. And as you also rightly say, gastric bands, gastric bypasses, sleeve gastrectomies, all of these things are really quite dangerous. They can result in things like blood clots and a lack of vitamins and minerals from your diet. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong with them. So this really does feel like a sort of last-minute intervention kind of medical treatment rather than a celebrity weight loss invention that people are going to be touting on Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, it's eye-catching stuff, isn't it, Alok? And there are lots of people in the world on social media who are trying to lose weight. So, they're going to be interested in this. There's also lots of people who want to say that people who are a bit too fat, it's all because they've got no willpower, and undermine arguments about genetics or, other factors that may be at play. But, I mean, we're actually talking about a device that's designed for morbidly obese people here. This isn't for someone who just wants to lose a few stone, is it? This is for people who are way beyond that.
Yeah, so I think you've put it well, actually. Those clarification tweets from the University of Otago seem to sort of put it into the right context. If this is a tool for medical professionals to help people who are endangering their lives because of their weight or need to reduce weight because of surgery, which is itself a difficult and traumatic procedure, then it's just another tool. It's like a scalpel, or it's like a surgeon's knife, or whatever. So it should not be something that you can just order off the internet and use for your weight loss. I think that if you're worried about people who might misuse things to lose weight quickly, there are other much more dangerous things like weird diet pills you can get on the internet with no idea what's in them, or crash diets, or multiple diets, or not eating at all. People who suffer from body dysmorphia, these sorts of things. These are issues that exist in our world right now that perhaps we should spend a bit more focus thinking about. This, I don't think, as long as it's not available on the internet tomorrow, I don't think it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, Julia, I've done a 6-part podcast for Audible Originals about this called Tip the Scales. And if you haven't downloaded it, the too long don't listen version is have a balanced diet, exercise, portion control, and exercise. However much journalism there is into this, that's the bottom line, really, if you want not to be fat. And it seems like almost any discussion about this is fueled by people looking for something other than that. And there isn't anything other than that.
I think something that's quite important that's come out from eating disorder charities in the last few days is that they've criticised this device for oversimplifying the issue of obesity. So they're saying that obesity actually is also linked to mental health issues as well, and to just kind of address the physical side of it without, as we were saying, a phased approach is important, but there's a lot more going on than just what's happening physically. And I think it's also important to think about questions like dignity and how people feel. A lot of people with obesity may already feel in some ways insecure or have issues that they're working with. And to then kind of put a device on someone that feels potentially slightly dehumanizing, or historic anyway, could also kind of exacerbate those. So as much as it might cause an initial weight loss, which it did with the people who took part in the study, they on average lost about 5% of their body weight in the 2-week period. Even so, those studies, often people quickly then regain weight as well after kind of drastic measures, because it doesn't really lead to a change in long-term behaviour and attitudes towards food, exercise and a balanced diet.
But isn't this just a medical device that is used under medical supervision with permission and consent? I would have a much bigger problem with it, and echo everything everyone's just said, if it was something you could just buy online on Amazon. If you can't do that, then it's just a medical device. And I think that it's just another tool that doctors and others can use to help people. And I think that seems okay.
But it does maybe show that the emphasis, Joe, in medical research, in government money that's available for that kind of research, is in the physical, when, as Julia was suggesting, there is obviously a psychological component as well.
No, I think you're quite right. There was 3 things that sort of sprang to mind while you guys were speaking there. The first of which is I do agree with Alok, actually, that this is a medical device designed to be used by medical professionals. It's not a thing that, the current crop of Love Island stars, if that's the right term, will be touting on their Instagram accounts when they leave the villa in 2 months. The second one, I agree with you, Ollie, and as Julia raised earlier, I do think that we do probably focus a lot on the physical sides of this stuff rather than the mental health sides of this stuff, and I mean that's abundantly evident when you look at cuts to NHS mental health services and all this kind of stuff. If you go to an NHS doctor tomorrow with weight-related issues, they will prescribe you. They're proportionally more likely to prescribe you physical-based treatments rather than mental-based treatments, even though the 2 things are often linked. And that sort of brings me on to my third point, which, Ollie, I kind of disagree with what you said earlier about it's as simple as have a balanced diet, do enough exercise, etc., etc. Because I don't think it is that simple. Because the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the US has found links between, for example, obesity and lower incomes, because lower incomes make it very difficult to sustain a balanced diet.
Right.
So
but the conclusion is still, if you were able to achieve a balanced diet, portion control, and exercise, then you would lose weight. I'm not saying there aren't factors that might stop that happening.
But that's why I think it's far more complicated than just saying, well, people should just have a balanced diet and do enough exercise, because, there is, as you pointed out just now, there is lots of factors, a multitude of factors around those 2 things that make them very, very difficult for certain people, often mental health linked, often income linked, that do create, what are kind of referred to as health inequalities. And that is an important element of this, not necessarily an important element of this, mouth structure, which is just for medical purposes, but is an important factor in this wider discussion, I think.
Julia, this was your story of the week. I'll give you the final word on this. What do you think the repercussions of this are for all of us listening?
I don't know. I know that we've stressed that this obviously is a medical device at this point, but we've also seen companies in recent decades kind of scam companies creating diet tools that promise people they can lose a certain amount of weight, and they're often not regulated, and there have been cases where people have been really severely ill. So I feel like the fact that this has gained so much traction doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to stop another company just springing up, and actually they might be on Amazon in a few weeks' time. We've got no idea. And I think also the researchers found that people said life in general felt less satisfying whilst taking part in this trial, which I think is really important. So it is much more about the wider issue, and the University of Otago has had a particularly tough time on Twitter this week dealing with it, but it has brought to light some really important conversations that we need to be having.
Well, it has brought some pleasure to our ears this week. My thanks to Julia, Joe and Alok for weighing in. Remember, you can subscribe to this show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.